guys, good to see you. So you're here because after we watch this video, you will be painting something special. So it could be a bunny, a turtle, a lion, maybe something else, I'm not sure. But before we start painting, we need to make sure that we warm ourselves up so that we're ready. Just like you do when you go and do any sort of sporting thing. So the way we warm up is we make sure we have our materials all ready, which you can find in the materials list below. And as part of that, we need to make sure our paints are all activated by wetting them. And I've already done that with my paints, so I'm going to get started. But if you haven't, please pause the video and go wet your paints and come back. So we just pick a colour, any colour. I'm going to pick this lovely teal turquoisey type colour. And all I'm going to do is just paint some thick and thin lines just to get my hand warmed up. So thick lines are by pressing hard, I get thick lines. And thin lines happen by only touching the paper a little bit. So just with the tip of my brush, if I just touch with just the tip, I can get really thin lines, all with the same paintbrush. And I might like to practice going from medium to thin or from thin to thick. Okay, so all of those different thicknesses happen from applying a different amount of pressure or pressing harder or lighter in some places. Then what we want to practice is a special technique that's sometimes called wet on wet. Now, wet on wet is a special technique because it's only used in watercolor, and it's how we get lovely smooth colors blending together. And it's a little bit of magic. So what I'm going to do is wet up my brush and paint a space on my paper. Hopefully you can see it's wet there, it's shiny, so that's how you know it's wet. And what I'm going to do is just get any color and touch it on that wet space. And hopefully what you can see is that the paint moves around that wet space, but nowhere else. So that technique is called wet on wet because we started with a wet square or a wet space and we added some wet paint in there. And the paint is moving around that wet area. Now that can also be called a bleed in watercolor. Now, it can be a really good thing, but it can also be a bit of a nuisance sometimes too, because let's say we're painting something and we want it to be crisp on the outside of it, a crisp outline. For example, on our turtle's eyes, just grab our turtle's eyes, we don't want that black anywhere else but in his eyeball. So we don't want the bleed to happen. But there's two colors touching, so how do we stop that? We have to work in layers. But sometimes we actually do want the bleed to happen, like in his shell, where we go from orange to yellow or from yellow to green, or you know, when you're getting a gradient of any two colors. Or in the background here, we also want some bleed. So what we do when we want the bleed is we start with our wet square or our wet shape. On our turtle, he hasn't got squares, he's just got shapes. And then we add, on one side of that, we add one of the colors that we want. And then wash our brush off, clean it off, scrape some of that water off. And then on the other side of that square or shape, we add the other color. And then we clean our brush off, use our paper towel to dry our brush. And then in the middle, we kind of just paint them backwards and forwards so that they mix together. And when that dries, you won't be able to tell that that blend has occurred. They will just be nice and blended together. And it's a nice idea as part of the warm-up to practice doing a rainbow, which I'm going to do right now. So if I want to do a rainbow, I like to start with red, so I pop a little bit of red here. Next on the rainbow is orange, yep. So I'll pop that next. Next to that will be some yellow, so I'll pop that next. Notice I'm not really doing very much when I pop it down, except just painting stripes that are close to each other. Next in my rainbow will be some sort of green. I might like to add 2 types of green. Dark green after my light green there. And then after green is blue. Clean my brush off, dry it off. And then a purple might be next. Clean my brush off. And then I'm going to finish off with a nice pink. Now, what I can do if it looks too stripy is I can go back with my paintbrush, clean it off, dry it off on the side, and then just anywhere it looks a little bit stripy, I can just brush those colors together a little bit. I don't want my brush to be very wet when I do that. If I want those colors to be smooth, sometimes you might like it to be quite wet. You can have a bit of a play and see what happens when you do that. But that's what happens if I create a rainbow there. So you see, you don't have to just do 2 colors, but it's easiest to just do 2 colors, of course. But you can do lots and lots of different colors, blend it out that way. So back to talking about layers. So when we're painting our turtle or our lion or our bunny, we work in layers. So what we need to do when we work in layers is we need to make sure the first layer is dry before we add the second layer. Otherwise we end up with the bleed, which, like we talked about before, we want sometimes, but not all the time. So you can dry your artwork off in a couple of different ways if you're painting in layers. And the first way you can do that is just by waiting. So you might just pause the video and then just wait and then come back to it when it's dry. Or you can use a hairdryer if you've got an adult there to help you. Or if you have one of these, you can also use a heat gun. Now, obviously, if you're using a heat gun and you're a little person, you might need some help from mum or dad or whoever's looking after you. So I'm just going to dry off a couple of my areas just to show you. And you'll know it's dry enough when it's not shiny anymore. So if I move my paper, I can see that I still have a couple of areas here and just here that are still shiny. That means they're not dry enough for me to add another layer. And I've done that on purpose so I can show you what happens. Let's say this is my turtle's face. If I add black there, see my black dot is growing. It's moving out of where I want it. But if I paint my black dot here, it doesn't move at all. Because that area is dry, I don't have to worry about it bleeding. Okay, it stays perfectly in the space that I've put it. Whereas if it's wet, it'll just move everywhere it's wet. So, I think that's about it for our warm up. So, it's time to watch the next video.